The year was 1925, and Howard Carter's team was conducting what should have been a routine examination of Tutankhamun's mummy when they discovered something that would send shockwaves through the archaeological community. As they carefully unwrapped the layers of linen, expecting to find the preserved remains of Egypt's boy king, they instead uncovered evidence of practices so disturbing that the discovery was immediately classified and hidden from public view for decades. What they found wasn't just unexpected. It was evidence of a civilization whose intimate practices were so extreme that Victorian archaeologists literally destroyed artifacts rather than acknowledge what ancient Egypt had actually been. The golden treasures, the magnificent monuments, the mysterious hieroglyphs that we celebrate today were just the surface layer of a society that operated under sexual and religious principles that would horrify modern minds. Today, we're going to expose the truth that museums around the world have spent over a century trying to hide. We're going to examine the archaeological evidence that reveals how ancient Egyptian civilization developed intimate practices that went far beyond anything you could imagine, and we're going to understand why this evidence was systematically concealed by scholars who couldn't handle what they had discovered. The story begins not with what we found, but with what was deliberately taken away. When Carter's team examined Tutankhamun's mummy, they made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about ancient Egyptian burial practices. The boy king's genitals had been surgically removed with the precision of a skilled physician, not damaged by time or decay, but deliberately cut away as part of the mummification process itself. This wasn't an isolated case. As more royal mummies underwent scientific examination using increasingly sophisticated techniques, a disturbing pattern emerged across Egyptian dynastic history. Multiple pharaohs showed evidence of genital modification or complete removal. Some had been subjected to enhancement procedures involving the insertion of foreign materials. Others displayed signs of castration performed with surgical precision that suggested these weren't punishments or accidents, but deliberate religious procedures. The most shocking discovery came from an unnamed prince of the 18th dynasty, whose mummy revealed that the genital removal had been performed while he was still alive. Medical analysis of bone structure and tissue remains indicated this was not a post-mortem modification, but a living procedure conducted as part of religious ritual. Ancient Egyptian texts that had previously seemed metaphorical suddenly took on horrifying literal meaning. References to making the dead more perfect for the afterlife, descriptions of preparing bodies for eternal service to the gods, and instructions for modifying the deceased to ensure proper spiritual function in the next world, all pointed to systematic practices that Victorian archaeologists couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge. But these post-mortem discoveries were just the beginning of what lay hidden in Egyptian tombs and temples. The real horror was what these modifications revealed about practices performed on the living. Ancient Egypt operated under a cosmological system that viewed sexual energy as divine energy. Every intimate act was potentially a religious ritual. Every expression of sexuality, a form of communication with the gods. This wasn't simply about personal pleasure or even reproduction. It was about cosmic control, divine power, and the systematic use of sexuality as a tool of political and religious domination. The pharaohs weren't just political rulers. They were living deities whose sexual performance was believed to directly influence the flooding of the Nile, the success of harvests, and the survival of Egyptian civilization itself. This created enormous pressure to demonstrate divine potency through increasingly extreme displays that went far beyond normal human sexuality. The evidence for these practices comes from sources that tourists never see and museum visitors are never told about. Temple inscriptions contain explicit descriptions of sexual rituals that were integral to Egyptian religious ceremonies. Papyrus documents describe techniques and practices that were considered essential for maintaining cosmic balance. Archaeological discoveries reveal architectural features specifically designed for group sexual activities that formed part of religious worship. When 19th century archaeologists first encountered this evidence, They were so scandalized that they chose concealment over scholarship. Rather than document what they found, they destroyed artifacts, burned papyri, and locked away inscriptions that revealed the true nature of Egyptian intimate practices. This systematic suppression created a sanitized version of ancient Egypt that bears little resemblance to the complex and often disturbing reality of how this civilization actually functioned. The sexual control system that governed Egyptian society operated through a rigid hierarchy that determined every aspect of intimate life. At the apex were the pharaohs whose sexual performance carried cosmic significance. Below them, nobles and priests faced constant pressure to prove their worthiness through sexual displays and religious devotion that often involved participation in ceremonies that would be considered criminal by modern standards. But it was at the bottom of this hierarchy that the true horror of the Egyptian system revealed itself. Domestic slaves, particularly children, faced systematic abuse that wasn't just tolerated, but was religiously mandated as essential for maintaining divine favor and cosmic order. Royal children born into elite families found themselves trapped in a system that treated their bodies as religious property rather than personal possessions. Ancient texts describe how wealthy families would dedicate their youngest children to temple service, where they underwent training in sexual techniques from ages as young as 6 or 7. These children were taught that their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the gods, and that sexual service was the highest form of religious devotion. The training these children endured was comprehensive and brutal. They learned specific positions designed for extended religious ceremonies, techniques for maintaining arousal during lengthy rituals, and methods for dissociating from their own physical sensations. Medical papyri describe the devastating physical toll this training took on developing bodies. Children developed chronic injuries from forced flexibility exercises, experienced stunted growth from nutritional restrictions designed to maintain childlike proportions, and many died from internal injuries or infections related to premature sexual activity. Legal documents reveal that child slaves could be bought and sold specifically for sexual purposes, with their value determined by age, appearance, and level of training. Wealthy Egyptians maintained private collections of children for personal use, while temples operated larger-scale training programs that supplied trained children for religious ceremonies and private contracts. The psychological impact on survivors was devastating. Those who lived to adulthood exhibited symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma. They had difficulty forming normal relationships, often became sexually compulsive or completely withdrawn, and frequently died young from what ancient texts euphemistically described as broken hearts. What made this systematic abuse even more horrifying was how it was justified through religious doctrine. Priests taught that sexual service to the gods was blessed rather than exploitative, that children chosen for such service were honored rather than victimized. Families were encouraged to feel grateful when their children were selected for temple duties, even when they understood the true nature of what would happen. The economic dimension added another layer of horror to these practices. Archaeological evidence suggests mortality rates among temple children exceeded 70%, with medical analysis revealing procedures that could last for hours and often resulted in fatal injuries. Yet wealthy patrons paid premium prices for access to these children, funding a systematic industry of abuse that operated for millennia with full religious and legal sanction. But if you think systematic child abuse was the worst aspect of Egyptian sexual practices, you're not prepared for what's coming next. The individual horrors we've examined so far pale in comparison to what happened when an entire civilization descended into week-long orgies of religious chaos during Egypt's most notorious festival. The Feast of Drunkenness represented the absolute pinnacle of Egyptian sexual extremism, transforming the entire kingdom into something that defied every concept of civilized behavior. What began as worship of the goddess Hathor evolved into an annual catastrophe that lasted 7 days and nights, during which normal social order completely collapsed. and the population engaged in acts that would be considered crimes against humanity by any modern standard. The festival's origins lay deep in Egyptian mythology, specifically the terrifying story of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who nearly exterminated humanity in a blood-drunk rampage. According to legend, the gods had to flood the land with beer mixed with red ochre to trick Sekhmet into thinking she was consuming blood, causing her to become so intoxicated that she forgot her murderous mission and transformed into the gentler Hathor. This myth became the template for celebrations that encouraged every Egyptian to drink themselves into divine possession. But calling it mere intoxication misses the true horror of what occurred. Participants didn't just consume alcohol. Temple authorities spent months brewing massive quantities of beer fortified with psychoactive substances derived from lotus flowers and other hallucinogenic plants. The resulting mixture created not just drunkenness, but vivid hallucinations and complete loss of inhibition. Participants reported experiencing visions, hearing divine voices, and feeling possessed by supernatural forces that compelled them to acts they would never consider while sober. When the festival commenced, every social boundary that normally governed Egyptian life simply vanished. Masters engaged in public sexual acts with their slaves in city squares while crowds cheered. Married women abandoned their families to join roving bands of intoxicated revelers who moved through the streets seeking new participants. Children were exposed to explicit, intimate acts and often became unwilling participants themselves as the entire civilization descended into chaos that lasted an entire week. Ancient texts describe scenes that shock even by modern standards. Groups of intoxicated Egyptians would storm through residential areas, breaking into homes and forcing inhabitants to join their celebrations, whether they wanted to or not. Women were subjected to group abuse that was considered religious communion with the divine. Men competed to see who could maintain sexual arousal for the longest periods while completely intoxicated, with winners receiving religious honors and social status. The violence was as extreme as the sexuality, creating a festival atmosphere where brutality became worship. Participants would attack each other with sexual frenzy, biting, scratching, and inflicting wounds that were considered marks of divine favor. Some revelers died from internal injuries caused by violent sexual acts performed by multiple partners. Others were trampled by crowds of intoxicated celebrants moving through narrow streets without awareness of their surroundings. What made these acts even more disturbing was the religious justification that sanctified every horror. Priests taught that any behavior performed during the festival was holy by definition, since participants were possessed by divine spirits and therefore incapable of sin. Abuse became religious communion, violence became sacred offering, and the systematic victimization of children became divine blessing that ensured Egypt's continued prosperity. Foreign visitors left accounts that reveal international horror at these celebrations. Mesopotamian diplomats described the festival as proof that Egyptians were barbarians disguised as a sophisticated civilization. Some neighboring kingdoms refused to send ambassadors to Egypt during festival periods, fearing for their safety and what they called moral contamination from witnessing such depravity. The festival's aftermath was as traumatic as the event itself, creating psychological devastation that rippled through Egyptian society for months afterward. Participants often had done while intoxicated, leading had no memory of what they to severe trauma when they discovered evidence of their actions. Families were destroyed when members learned what their relatives had done during the celebration. Children born 9 months after the festival faced lifelong stigma as offspring of divine possession rather than normal conception. The economic impact was staggering in its scope and destructiveness. Entire cities would shut down for a week while the population engaged in drunken revelry. Agricultural work stopped completely, trade ceased, and government functions ground to a halt as officials joined the celebrations. The cost in lost productivity was enormous, Yet pharaohs considered it a necessary expense to maintain cosmic balance and prevent divine retribution. But the festival also served calculated political purposes that reveal the cynical manipulation underlying the religious justification. By providing a controlled outlet for social tensions, it allowed the Egyptian system to maintain rigid hierarchy for most of the year. Citizens could rebel against authority, slaves could humiliate their masters, and social norms could be violated, but only during this carefully contained period of chaos that ultimately reinforced the existing power structure. Archaeological evidence confirms the extreme nature of these festivals through discoveries that museums still refuse to display publicly. Excavations of temple sites reveal specialized chambers designed specifically for group sexual activities, with architectural features that suggest they were used for violent and degrading acts. Stone platforms show wear patterns consistent with restraints, drainage systems designed to handle bodily fluids, and wall decorations depicting acts so explicit that they remain in restricted storage. The physical evidence matches the disturbing accounts left by ancient writers who witnessed these festivals firsthand. Medical papyri describe treatments for injuries sustained during the celebrations, including internal trauma, broken bones, and infections that resulted from the unsanitary conditions and violent sexual practices. Temple records document the resources required to clean up after each festival, including the disposal of bodies and the treatment of survivors. Even more disturbing was how the festival's chaos provided cover for the systematic abuse of the most vulnerable members of society. Child trafficking networks operated openly during festival periods, moving young victims between cities under the protection of religious celebration. Wealthy patrons could engage in acts that would normally result in prosecution, knowing that festival possession provided complete legal immunity for any behavior. The systematic collapse of Egyptian sexual culture began during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers attempted to impose Mediterranean values on Egyptian religious practices. This cultural collision created a crisis that ultimately destroyed both systems, while leaving a legacy of trauma that affected Egyptian society for generations. The Ptolemies found themselves in an impossible position, needing to participate in Egyptian religious festivals to maintain legitimacy with their subjects, while being horrified by the extreme sexual practices they encountered. Their attempts at reform triggered religious crises that threatened the stability of their rule. Yet continuing the practices in their original form risked rebellion from their Greek supporters and eventual Roman oversight. Cleopatra I attempted to find a middle ground by modifying the Feast of Drunkenness, reducing its duration from 7 days to 3, and imposing restrictions on the most violent aspects of the celebration. These reforms triggered immediate backlash from Egyptian priests, who argued that altering sacred traditions would bring cosmic disaster upon the kingdom. They pointed to natural catastrophes, military defeats, and economic problems as evidence that the gods were already displeased with foreign interference in their ancient rites. The religious establishment's resistance wasn't merely ceremonial opposition. Temple records reveal organized campaigns to undermine Ptolemaic authority by spreading rumors that the Greek rulers' modifications had angered the gods and brought divine punishment upon Egypt. Priests encouraged secret celebrations of the original festival, creating underground networks that operated outside royal control and maintained the most extreme practices in hidden locations. The crisis reached its peak during the reign of Cleopatra III, who faced the impossible task of satisfying both Egyptian religious expectations and increasing Roman political pressure. Roman observers were scandalized by what they witnessed of Egyptian sexual practices, viewing them as evidence of barbarism and moral decay that threatened the stability of the entire region. Yet Egyptian priests threatened outright rebellion if traditional festivals were abandoned entirely. Cleopatra's solution was to create a two-tiered system that satisfied no one while creating new forms of systematic abuse. Public versions of religious festivals were sanitized for Roman consumption, featuring symbolic rather than actual sexual rituals. Meanwhile, Private ceremonies for Egyptian religious leaders maintained the original practices in secret chambers that Roman officials were forbidden to enter. This compromise created a culture of hypocrisy and concealment that made the abuse of vulnerable populations even more systematic and hidden. Child trafficking increased dramatically as desperate rulers tried to prove their devotion to Egyptian traditions while hiding the evidence from Roman oversight. Children were moved through underground networks that operated between temples, private estates, and secret ceremonial sites. The psychological impact on Egyptian society during this period was catastrophic. Generations had been raised in a system that normalized sexual violence as religious devotion, and when external pressure forced changes to these practices, many Egyptians experienced profound cultural trauma. They had lost not just religious traditions, but their entire framework for understanding sexuality, divinity, and social relationships. Medical papyri from this period describe increasing rates of what ancient physicians called disorders of the mind among both perpetrators and survivors of the sexual practices. Former temple children who had been trained from early ages for sexual service found themselves unable to function in a changing society that no longer recognized their conditioning as religiously valuable. The underground continuation of extreme practices became even more dangerous than the original open celebrations. Without official oversight or medical supervision, the mortality rates among participants increased dramatically. Secret festivals held in hidden locations lacked the safety measures that temples had traditionally maintained, leading to more deaths from violence, overdoses of psychoactive substances, and untreated injuries. Roman military reports describe discovering hidden chambers where dozens of bodies were found after clandestine celebrations went wrong. The evidence suggested mass casualties from combinations of drug toxicity, sexual violence, and simple neglect of basic safety precautions that had previously been maintained by temple authorities. The final collapse of the Egyptian sexual system came with Augustus Caesar's conquest in 30 BCE. The first Roman emperor was personally horrified by what his forces discovered in Egyptian temples and immediately ordered the complete suppression of sexual religious practices throughout the province. Roman soldiers systematically destroyed explicit artwork, burned religious texts, and executed priests who refused to abandon traditional ceremonies. But the Romans didn't simply suppress Egyptian sexual practices. They conducted what amounted to a campaign of cultural genocide, systematically erasing evidence that such practices had ever existed. Temples were stripped of explicit decorations that had adorned walls for millennia. Papyri describing sexual rituals were gathered and burned in massive bonfires. Even architectural features designed specifically for religious sexuality were destroyed or sealed behind new construction. The children who'd in this had been trapped system faced a particularly tragic fate under Roman rule. Many had been so thoroughly conditioned for sexual service that they possessed no other skills or understanding of how to function in normal society. Roman records describe former temple children who committed suicide rather than face a world where their perceived value and purpose had been eliminated overnight. Those who survived carried trauma that affected Egyptian society for generations after the Roman conquest. The systematic sexual abuse had created patterns of behavior, belief, and social organization that couldn't be easily erased by political changes. Roman governors reported ongoing problems with underground sexual cults, child trafficking networks, and religious movements that attempted to restore traditional practices in secret. The Romans also discovered evidence that revealed the true scope of what had been occurring throughout Egyptian history. Administrative documents showed that the sexual practices hadn't been limited to religious festivals or temple activities, but had permeated every level of Egyptian society for over 3,000 years. Household records revealed systematic abuse within elite families. Commercial documents showed extensive trafficking networks, and medical texts described treatments for injuries and diseases that that could only have resulted from the most extreme sexual practices. Archaeological excavations conducted under Roman oversight uncovered mass graves near temple sites containing the remains of thousands of children and young adults who had died from injuries consistent with sexual violence. The scale of the discoveries was so overwhelming that Roman authorities initially refused to believe their own reports, assuming that local officials were exaggerating to justify their harsh suppression measures. Carbon dating of these remains later confirmed that the systematic abuse had continued uninterrupted for millennia, with evidence suggesting that mortality rates among temple children had actually increased during the later periods of Egyptian independence. The pressure to maintain traditional practices in the face of foreign criticism had made the system more deadly, rather than reforming it. The cover-up of Egyptian sexual practices didn't end with Roman suppression. When European archaeologists began excavating Egyptian sites in the 18th and 19th centuries, they encountered evidence that challenged every assumption about ancient civilization and human nature. Their response was to create one of history's most comprehensive and successful campaigns of academic censorship. Giovanni Belzoni's discovery of explicit sexual wall paintings in the tomb of Seti I in 1817 established the pattern that would govern archaeological practice for the next century and a half. Rather than document what he found, Belzoni ordered the paintings covered with plaster and published accounts that described the tomb as containing beautiful religious scenes while completely omitting the graphic sexual content that filled several chambers. This became standard practice throughout the Victorian era of Egyptian exploration. Auguste Mariette, who founded the Egyptian Antiquities Service, maintained private collections of explicit artifacts that were never displayed publicly and were accessible only to male scholars who agreed to strict confidentiality requirements. When the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was established, entire categories of artifacts were relegated to restricted storage areas that most visitors never knew existed. The suppression extended far beyond simple concealment of offensive imagery. Victorian translators routinely edited sexual content out of ancient texts, replacing explicit descriptions with euphemistic phrases or simply omitting entire passages that dealt with intimate practices. The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of the most important medical texts from ancient Egypt, contained over 40 sections dealing with sexual practices that weren't translated until the 1970s. Perhaps most shocking was the systematic destruction of evidence by archaeologists who couldn't reconcile what they found with their moral sensibilities. Flinders Petrie openly admitted in his private journals to destroying artifacts he considered too obscene for scholarly study. His accounts describe burning papyri, smashing statues, and burying artifacts that depicted sexual acts he couldn't bring himself to document. The academic conspiracy extended to universities and scholarly institutions throughout Europe and America. Research proposals dealing with Egyptian sexuality were routinely rejected as inappropriate for serious study. Students who expressed interest in these topics were discouraged from pursuing them or expelled from programs entirely. Academic journals refused to publish papers that discussed sexual practices, even when they were based on solid archaeological evidence. Museums developed elaborate systems for hiding sexual artifacts from public view, while maintaining the fiction that they were simply protecting public morality. The British Museum alone has over 2,000 suppressed Egyptian artifacts stored in restricted access areas, labelled only as miscellaneous pottery or decorative objects to discourage casual inquiry. This Victorian legacy continues to shape public understanding of ancient Egypt even today. Popular documentaries, museum exhibitions, and educational materials focus almost exclusively on political history, religious beliefs, and artistic achievements, while completely ignoring the sexual practices that were central to Egyptian culture for 3,000 years. The result is a sanitized version of history that bears little resemblance to the complex and often disturbing reality of how ancient Egyptian civilization actually functioned. The ongoing concealment has created massive gaps in public knowledge about human sexuality, religious practices, and social organization in one of history's most influential civilizations. The systematic suppression has also prevented serious academic study of how extreme sexual practices can become institutionalized within sophisticated civilizations, depriving modern society of crucial insights into the warning signs and prevention of systematic abuse. The lessons that could be learned from Egyptian history remain locked away in museum storage rooms and restricted academic archives. Modern attempts to examine these suppressed materials face continued resistance from institutions that fear public reaction to disturbing historical truths. As recently as 2019, major museums were caught actively concealing newly discovered papyri that contained explicit sexual content, demonstrating that the Victorian pattern of suppression continues into the 21st century. The few scholars who have gained access to restricted materials describe discoveries that revolutionize our understanding of ancient Egyptian society while confirming the most disturbing aspects of historical accounts. These revelations suggest that the practices we've examined represent only the surface of a systematic culture of sexual extremism that operated on a scale unprecedented in human history. What we've uncovered today represents more than just historical curiosity. It reveals how easily sophisticated civilizations can normalize the most extreme forms of human exploitation when those practices become intertwined with religious belief and political power. Ancient Egypt's sexual extremism wasn't the product of primitive barbarism, but of a highly organized society that systematically weaponized intimacy for cosmic control. The evidence remains largely hidden because confronting these truths forces uncomfortable questions about human nature itself. How does a civilization that created magnificent art and architecture simultaneously operate industrial-scale child abuse? How do religious beliefs transform sexual violence into sacred duty? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what other historical horrors remain concealed in museum storage rooms around the world? The Victorian archaeologists who chose concealment over scholarship believed they were protecting public morality. Instead, they denied us crucial lessons about how systematic abuse becomes institutionalized within sophisticated societies. The warning signs they buried could have helped prevent similar horrors throughout history. Until museums open their restricted collections and scholars overcome their discomfort with disturbing truths, we'll continue living with a sanitized version of human history that ignores the darkest chapters of our past. The real tragedy isn't just what happened in ancient Egypt, but what we've refused to learn from it. The evidence is there, waiting in sealed storage rooms and classified archives. The question is whether we're finally ready to confront what it reveals about the capacity for evil that exists within every civilization, including our own.